So Ryan Faulk just put out a new video sort of redoing his argument against white nationalism and expounding upon his vision for his ideological filter state. In this video, he responds to a lot of the criticisms that were leveled at his first video, some of which were made by us. Unfortunately, it seems he's gone for good this time, and his arguments in this video are pretty bad, so we're just going to knock it out quickly before we put out our first episode.
So the first thing to point out is that whites are not politically all that exceptional. I'm going to blast through this. You can press pause or read the original article. First, free speech. Whites in the EU are worse than non-whites in the US on free speech. If you care about free speech, non-whites in the US are better than whites in the EU. And the question is about racist statements. It's not a bullshit free speech question. Now, it does depend on how the question is worded. For example, here, the question regarding speech supposedly designed to stir up racial hatred. Obviously, laws against such things are very Orwellian because any judge can just say you're trying to stir up racial hatred. But when you get more concrete, whites and non-whites are actually more in favor of free speech.
So what Ryan Faulk is doing here is honestly, look, it's a rhetorical trick or it's a fancy backswing. What he's trying to do is he's trying to avoid a contradiction that we spoke about in our last video. What I said in our last video is that if you live in a proposition nation or a nation based on an idea and you disagree with that idea, people see you as more against what that nation fundamentally is than they would see even somebody who's not part of that nation. I use the example that in America, millions of Americans, tens of millions, will think that an illegal immigrant who has no family here, who has no citizenship, who isn't white, who has just nothing, no part in this nation, they will think that he's more American than somebody who disagrees with the proposition that America is now based on. It wasn't based on in the 1970s, but it's based on it right now. Now, Ryan Faulk is using a rhetorical trick, and that's what it is. It's a trick, where he understands that his idea was fundamentally contradictory and that you can't have real robust speech in a proposition nation. But instead of dealing that, what he's doing is he's using things that are essential parts of free speech in 2018 and that are things that we very closely affiliate with being free speech. For instance, one of the big free speech issues of today is whether or not you should be allowed to say racist things in public or whether or not you should be allowed to be a Muslim. However, those things have a very stark difference from actual free speech, namely that they don't run into the contradiction of a proposition nation. You could have a proposition nation where people are saying racist things, or you could have a proposition nation based on Islam. There aren't actual problems with that, but it kind of reminds us of free speech. The point that I made in our last video wasn't about who likes free speech, and it wasn't about who supports free speech. It was about the fundamental conditions that need to be there if we're going to have free speech. And in a proposition nation, you just do run into that contradiction where even if you have a society where the only proposition you need to accept, the proposition nation based only that you accept the proposition of free speech, well, some number of people aren't going to like free speech, and those people will be anywhere from marginalized to attacked by their equivalent of Antifa to just, told that you can maybe have free speech in your backyard or, here's your speech, let's put it up on the refrigerator. What there needs to be in order to have any robust free speech isn't support for saying racist comments. What you need to have robust free speech is the unconditional love and support and acceptance of a people, and that's the kind of unconditional support that you can get in an ethno-state, and only in an ethno-state. Now, I'm not out to dispute, stats that there are a lot of non-whites who do support free speech. But to those non-whites who support free speech, what I would say to them is that if they support free speech so much, then what they really need is they need an ethno-state in order to really have it.
Alright, so for the next 5 minutes or so, Ryan bombards us with a lot of statistics intended to demonstrate that the gaps in political views between whites and non-whites aren't as vast as we might imagine. And frankly, after a while, it gets really redundant. I think he's doing what he called in his debate with Crowd reading the phone book. That is to say, he is citing statistic after statistic after statistic in order to bolster his own credibility, in order to seem intimidating and produce the psychological effect in the listener. And this wouldn't be so bad if he weren't just telling us a bunch of shit we already know. I mean, Ryan, we know that 37% of whites voted for Hillary. We know that Sweden exists. We know that plenty of whites have atrocious, terrible, shit-lib views. But disregarding the obnoxiousness of these tactics, let's address his actual point.
Okay, so the point of this is not to say, oh, how wonderful Hispanics and blacks in the United States are. It's just to show how unexceptional whites are. Yes, whites are a little better on just about every issue, but not to such a degree that one should base an entire ideology around the superior political views of whites versus non-white.
Nobody does that. Nobody supports white nationalism because whites are better on gun control. Nobody's a white nationalist because whites support lower taxes. I'm not a white nationalist because whites hold extraordinary political views. I'm a white nationalist because whites are extraordinary, and more importantly, because they are mine. All of the political views that you listed, from economic libertarianism to opposition to gun control to immigration restrictionism, all of these things are valuable to the extent that they support the existence of our people in a future for white children. I don't care about these policies in and of themselves. I care about these policies to the extent that they help my race. And I don't know what to tell you other than that your priorities are in literally the opposite direction of everybody else in this thing. You're putting the policies before the people they're intended to serve.
If you want to say it's not about such things, it's about my people, right or wrong, okay, well, I would have to call into question whether they really are your people if they don't care about their own existence and think that steps taken to preserve their existence and sovereignty are hateful and bigoted, and you're demonic for even proposing such things.
So the first thing that I want to say here is that out of all the laundry list of stats that we just kind of skipped past, none of them were about whether or not we should continue to exist. You had people's thoughts on tax policy, but this is one of the reasons why we think that was just a tactic and why that was just to build up credibility, because here you are saying something that you do not have stats for. I would actually like to see a poll that asks different racial groups how important it is to them that white people continue to exist or that white people are happy going into the future.
Now, Ryan might try to say that those polls on immigration and amnesty could be sort of one-to-one analogs for that on the opinions of white people as to their right to exist, their right to have sovereignty in their own nations into the future. I don't think that's correct, however. I think that normies can't really understand in a scientific, rigorous sense the full demographic implications of immigration policy. They don't really understand what amnesty would entail.
Yeah, just running a debate subreddit, r debate alt-right, one of the questions that's at this point so common that it's quite frankly kind of annoying is that we get these white people, often from the left, who come in here asking, like, how does it harm us if there's Mexicans in America, or if we become a minority? How does somebody's mere existence reduce our numbers? And this is something that we have to explain to people, and when you explain to people, you do find that these are people who they're not ill-meaning. They don't want their race to die out. They're not okay with dying out. They just don't understand the causal chain of events.
Right. At the end of the day, everybody has a survival instinct, and for a lot of white people, they just lack the vocabulary to sufficiently express their survival instinct in an articulate way that really gets to the core of the issue. So I don't think you can use these polls that Ryan cites as simple proxies for the white willingness to survive. I just don't think it's that simple. Anyway, the next few points that he makes we responded to in our first video, so let me skip forward to a new point.
Irish. It's that retarded. When you break down white people, even in the United States, you see massive differences between European ethnicities in terms of party registration. Differences of roughly the same magnitude as that between whites and Hispanics and Asians. In terms of income, at the extreme ends, gaps between European ethnic groups within the United States are of similar magnitude as that between whites and Hispanics, or even whites and blacks. The point of this isn't fuck you for being poor, it's just to highlight that there are really profound differences within the greater European population. There's no singular European population, and these differences are almost certainly, to some degree, genetic.
Also not included in Ryan Faulk's phone book of statistics, any evidence that the Swedes are more genetically predisposed to conservatism than the Norwegians.
I'm tired of being a chump, or to use internet lingo, a cuck for some idealized white race.
Alright, you haven't been a chump, Ryan. You haven't been a cuck. Obviously, you have a lot of fun being a dissident intellectual online. You have a Patreon that you plug in like every video. Yeah, some people have suffered. Some people have suffered losses for this movement, but the vast majority of us, including myself, have not. Personally, I've had a lot of fun making Disney parodies, meeting cool new people online, being exposed to cool new ideas. For me, this movement has been nothing but an unqualified joy and pleasure to be a part of, and I think that for the vast majority of people, it's been the same.
I've sacrificed absolutely nothing for this movement.
That doesn't exist and never existed. What I did, and what I think white nationalists in general do, is look at the reality of other races, but look at whites like a work in progress, as fallen from who they really are, the real white race. That's what I thought, and I think it came from a misreading of history. The U.S. were definitely pan-European white nationalists. And so, in a sense, the United States was founded in a pan-European white nationalism. And before, I saw this as living proof of pan-Europeanism. Not that I wanted Europe to become this way, not that I had some great desire to wipe Poland from the map, but simply that the United States was proof that it could work. And, well, maybe Brazil, in a sense, works, in the sense that it hasn't exploded yet, but there isn't some great white solidarity in the United States except in a very specific situation, and that was when whites lived near blacks. The increasing proportion of a county that is Asian or Hispanic does not cause the whites there to become more conservative.
Well, that makes sense, right? Conservatism is in many ways just an obvious logistical way to deal with the problems caused by blacks. Blacks commit the most crimes, and conservatives want a lot of police force. Blacks collect a lot of welfare, and conservatives want to cut welfare. Obama-era policies will give black people homes in your neighborhood, whereas Asians, and to a lesser extent Hispanics, can buy their own homes. Not everything is symbols. This is really just logistics.
Right. We can't just take conservatism as a simple one-to-one proxy for white identity. I mean, keep in mind the Republican Party is the party of the RAISE Act, which, if you have a problem with Asians, isn't exactly the best policy for you. So I don't think conservatism is a good proxy for white hostility to Asians or Hispanics in the same way it is for blacks. I think that's just kind of self-explanatory.
On a state level. I'm not a white nationalist. I don't think of myself as a civic nationalist, but if you want to call me that, sure, whatever. But when I hear I'm putting forth a proposition state versus an American white nationalist who says he supports a real flesh and blood group of people, a real nation, well, I think U.S. conservative is more of a real nation than U.S. whites are. U.S. conservatives are deeply territorial, work constantly for the supremacy of their beliefs, are increasingly intolerant of mixed ethnicity marriages. You know, in the case of the conservatives and liberals mixing, right? The ethnicity of the conservatives and the ethnicity of the liberals mixing. I jest a little bit here, but you tell me, how does U.S. conservative not function as an ethnicity, and as far as I can see, a more vital and robust ethnicity than white American?
So, look, in a sense, you could say that I'm not really a white nationalist. I'm kind of a white globalist, because I don't actually want there to be one white nation spanning however far across the globe. And, you know, sure, if we're going to talk about whatever little bureaucratic districts we could have, maybe conservatism actually would be a better state, not a better nation, but a better state than America is. Even if there was absolutely no diversity in America, I would probably still at least say that the North and the South should probably not be in the same union. But at the same time, I think that what he's saying is enormously misleading. Let me tell you something that is straightforwardly not a nation. Something that is not a nation is white America and white South Africa. Now, white South Africans are honestly a bunch of shitlibs who voted for their own demise and are now facing the consequences of it. However, I still like them. I don't want them to die. I don't want them to be genocided, and I feel something really strong in connection with them, even though I'm not part of their ethnicity, I'm not part of their state, I'm not part of really anything other than their race. That's what I am as a white person, and that's why I actually now prefer the term white person to alt-right or to white nationalist or anything else that you might come up with. So sure, maybe Ryan has a point in terms of some weird little better way to bureaucratically run the United States, but I just don't care about that.
Right. I don't think a lot of people would say that white Americans are a distinct ethnicity or a distinct nation in a very strong, robust way. I don't think that's something that any white nationalist is really advocating. I think that America has a lot of very strong regional identities, regional white identities, and I am entirely in support of fostering these, but...
And a lot of those do stand by themselves as actual ethnicities.
Right.
Now, among others, you and I have a Confederate flag, and that's not because we consider ourselves Southerners. I'm not from the South.
Though we do live in Covington, Georgia.
I thought it was Covington, Pennsylvania.
But anyway, it doesn't matter that neither of us were born in the South. We have that Dixie flag because we feel a sense of racial solidarity and kinship with Southerners simply by dint of being white. We own it in the same way we might own and fly a Norwegian flag. So sure, white American isn't exactly a coherent ethnicity or nation, but there are plenty of coherent, strong, viable ethnicities and nations within the United States among white Americans, and we can still have this sense of racial loyalty and kinship and mutual defense with one another.
One thing I talked about in my previous video was immigration vetting based on political views and how you could screen liars. You can screen liars based on autonomic things like disgust response or the blink response or the ability to maintain eye contact along...
Staring contest nationalism.
with party registration from the state they're coming from. For example, an immigrant from California, well, you'd want to know his party registration, what neighborhood he came from, his autonomic responses, blink response, discuss response, ability to maintain eye contact, his race, his facial structure, and put all that data in an algorithm and figure with probably 95% accuracy over 90% confidence interval what his political views are. And people have been commenting on this and how this is gangly and unwieldy. Not really. I mean, truthfully, you could do all these tests in about 10 minutes per person.
So, I don't know who Ryan Faulk was responding to. Now, yesterday we did a big criticism of just people don't want to do this, and we said that because honestly the things he says, I don't want to go into it all again, but they're just straightforwardly and obviously Orwellian and invasive and ridiculous on their face, at least in our video. I don't know what others said. We didn't criticize them for taking a long time. It's not that people don't want to put up with a process that can take a couple hours. It's that people don't want that done, period. I would much rather us just...
It's so fucking stupid and autistic to have a staring contest, to have somebody's facial features, to have stress tests be the criterion to go into a nation. That's so obvious.
Oh, it's so... Yeah, it's so much better in every single way to just have us go by the way that we've just naturally grouped for all of history.
If you have someone doing it quickly, and you have a system in place to do it quickly. I mean, it's a little bit complicated to explain, but once you have it up and running and people doing it, it wouldn't be that complicated. And you could say that this is utopian, and I'm talking about things that will probably never come to pass, and that's fine, but you have to talk about these things, because when you're talking about what it is you're proposing, you have to have answers to these kinds of questions, and that's my answer on the immigration policy on this conservative ethno-state, so to speak. But see, all this is assuming that there are even people who will try to lie to get in, which there probably wouldn't be a whole lot of. But see, political discrimination is far more socially acceptable than racial discrimination in the United States. And there are several states in the U.S.
We face political discrimination. That's the one we face. States.
And there are several states in the U.S. that still allow political discrimination. But political discrimination is actually a kind of genetic discrimination to the extent that political views are partly genetically determined, and a form of ethnic discrimination in the sense that conservatives and liberals are functionally ethnicities. And if you want to say no, these aren't functional ethnicities, but are just ideologies that can't be an ethnicity, well, what's Mormonism? That's clearly an ideology of a sort.
Everything has a significant genetic component. Everybody knows this. Ryan Faulk knows this. The only reason he's even bothering to make this stupid argument is because he knows that it'll really piss off his subscribers if he moves away from genes altogether.
All right, so in the next part of the video, Ryan talks about his European Revolution theory and basically just explains that he feels no group loyalty to white people, but just the products of the European Revolution. I really don't feel like getting into that, so let me just get past that and we'll get to his final point.
Or maybe I'm just cucking out, or quitting. Or maybe I just got black-pilled or something, guys. And people say black-pilled, and sure, maybe whatever. I mean, I guess you could say I'm black-pilled, RE, pan-European white nationalism, sure. But what people saying this, they're not getting is that this is not really about being black-pilled per se. This is a major change in how I view things.
Well, no, it is about being black-pilled in the same way that, look, if a MGTOW comes up to you and says, oh, it's not that I'm black-pilled on women, I just had a change of perspective on things. I mean, obviously one of these things is more desirable than the other. He just feels that logistically one is no longer attainable to him, so he has to go through all these weird rationalizations. And the very fact that so much of your argument was based upon the fact that white people aren't standing up for themselves, I mean, like, to me, on some level, that just implies that, like, if white people were standing up for themselves, it would be preferable to have an ethno-state, but, oh, they're not, so I guess we have to have our Asian girlfriend state. I mean, it's weak, and it's gay, and nobody wants this. Nobody likes this. I mean, like, look at the dislike to like ratio on your video. Everyone hates this. You're not going to get any traction with this, even with normies. Nobody's going to want this weird country where you have to win a staring contest and have the right face to get in. This is just terrible. This is bad.
Yeah, let's just. I feel like we're done here.